The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Written by Muriel Spark. Chapter 1. A group of 5 teenage boys and 5 16-year-old girls are socializing near the gates of the Marcia Blaine School in Edinburgh, Scotland, the boys positioning their bicycles so as to form a protective fence between the sexes. The girls belong to the Brodie set, named after their former teacher, Miss Jean Brodie. This is what they have been called ever since they were students at the junior school, and even their headmistress, later identified as Miss McKay, calls them this in scorn. The girls moved from the junior to the senior school at the age of 12. Even when they are students at the junior school, the Brodie girls are recognizable as Miss Jean Brodie's pupils because they were vastly informed on a lot of subjects irrelevant to the authorized curriculum, everything from Mussolini, the fascist prime minister of Italy during World War II, to methods of cleaning the skin with cream and witch hazel, from Miss Brodie's love life to those who considered the Bible to be untrue. By the age of 16, the girls have adapted to the other authority figures at the school, yet remain unmistakably influenced by Miss Brodie. They are famous school-wide in the sense that they are held in suspicion and disliked. They have no team spirit and have little in common with each other than remaining friends with Miss Brodie, who still teaches at that time in the junior department despite being held in great suspicion. Each girl in the Brodie set is famous for something. Monica Douglas, red-nosed and fat-legged, is a prefect famous for her mathematical ability and violent anger. Rose Stanley is famous for sex. Eunice Gardner, small and neat, is famous for her sprightly gymnastics and glamorous swimming. Sandy Stranger is notorious for her small, almost non-existent, eyes and famous for her vowel sounds, which long ago so enraptured Miss Brodie that she asked Sandy to recite a stanza from Tennyson's poem, The Lady of Shalott. Where there is no vision, the people perish, Miss Brodie had said on that occasion. The prettiest and most graceful member of the Brodie set is Jenny Gray, who is Sandy's best friend and wants to be an actress. The narrative returns to the scene of the boys and girls socializing. One of the 5 boys, named Andrew, is insulting Jenny about her way of speech. She tells him not to be a lout, but he and 2 other boys, both also named Andrew, just mimic her, to the laughter of the girls present. Just then the final member of the Brodie set, Mary McGregor, comes along, accompanied by an outsider to the set, Joyce Emily Hammond, a very rich girl and delinquent sent to Blaine as a last resort. Joyce Emily is trying very hard to become a member of the Brodie set, but there is no chance of it. Joyce Emily says that a teacher is coming, and 2 of the Andrews depart on their bicycles while the other 3 boys defiantly remain. The teacher turns out to be Miss Jean Brodie herself. She excuses the boys, walks away with all of the girls, but soon excuses Joyce as well, leaving the Brodie set to their secret life as it had been 6 years ago in their childhood. Following behind, Sandy remembers one of Miss Brodie's sayings from that time. I am putting old heads on your young shoulders, and all my pupils are the creme de la creme. As they walk together, Miss Brodie invites the 6 girls to supper and insists that Jenny come even though she has plans with the Dramatic Society. For there is a plot afoot, Miss Brodie says, to force her to resign her teaching post. There have been such plots afoot before. It has been suggested that Miss Brodie apply to one of the progressive schools, but she thinks these schools crank, eccentric, and insists that Blaine needs her to elevate their program. Give me a girl at an impressionable age, and she is mine for life, Miss Brodie says. The Brodie set smile as in understanding of various kinds. Rose asks who is responsible for the plot, and Miss Brodie says that they would discuss that together at supper, assuring the girls nonetheless that those who opposed her would not succeed. The girls agree. Miss Brodie concludes by saying that she is still in her prime, tells the girls that it is important to recognize the years of one's prime. Then she boards a tramcar and departs. The narrative shifts to 6 years before. Miss Brodie is leading her new class of 10-year-old girls to the garden for a history lesson. On the way, they stop outside of the headmistress Miss McKay's office, where a poster of Stanley Baldwin, a British Prime Minister, is hanging, with the words, "Safety first." Miss Brodie tells her class that goodness, truth, and beauty come first, not safety. This is the girls' first intimation that Miss Brodie is at odds with the rest of the teaching staff and, indeed, that adults could differ from one another at all. Outside, Miss Brodie then instructs her girls to hold up their books as if doing their history lesson, but tells them instead about her summer holiday in Egypt, among other subjects like skincare. She asks who the greatest Italian painter is, and when one girl responds that it is Leonardo da Vinci, Miss Brodie says, "That is incorrect. The answer is Giotto. He is my favorite." Next, Miss Brodie tells the girls that her prime has truly begun, and that they themselves must be able to recognize their primes and live life to the full during those years. Observing meanwhile that Mary is looking at something under her desk, Miss Brodie asks her what it is. "A comic paper," Mary replied. Miss Brodie tells Mary that she is too old for comic papers, takes the colored sheets of Tiger Tims from her, and tears the comic paper up beyond redemption. She then returns to the subject of her prime, checking to make sure that Sandy has been paying attention, which she has. Later that same autumn, during the hour for English grammar, Miss Brodie also tells her class about a man she had been engaged to, later identified as Hugh. He had died during World War I on Flanders Field a week before the armistice. After interrupting herself to chastise Sandy for having her sleeves rolled up, Miss Brodie goes on. Her fiancé had been poor, a countryman from Ayrshire, a county in Scotland, and upon proposing he had told her, "We shall have to drink water and walk slow," which, Miss Brodie explains to her class, meant that the couple would have to live quietly. When Miss Brodie asks Rose what "we shall have to drink water and walk slow" means, the young student just regurgitated her teacher's own translation of the saying. As Miss Brodie is telling the story of her fiancé, Miss McKay approaches. Several of the girls in the class are crying at this point over Hugh's fate, and their headmistress inquires as to why. Miss Brodie explains that she has been telling a story as part of their history lesson. Miss McKay in turn tells the girls that they should not be crying over history at the age of 10. After Miss McKay goes, Miss Brodie tells her class that they did well in not answering Miss McKay's question. "Speech is silver, but silence is golden," she says. She then quizzes Mary as to what she has just said, but Mary hasn't been paying attention. "If only you small girls would listen to me," Miss Brodie had said, "I would make of you the creme de la creme." Chapter 2. Mary McGregor, though she lives to be 24 years old, never realizes that Miss Brodie only shares her love story with her pupils. A year after World War II began, Mary joins the Wrens, Women's Royal Naval Service. She is incompetent in the service and much blamed. She meets her first and last boyfriend during this period, a corporal, who ends up deserting her. Thinking back to see if she had ever been happy, it occurs to Mary that it was those first years with Miss Brodie in the 1930s, listening to her stories and opinions, that had been the happiest time of her life. Even though Miss Brodie had called Mary such a clumsy girl and treated her condescendingly, Mary would later die during the war, while on leave, in a hotel fire. Sandy Stranger, while Miss Brodie's pupil, also has a feeling that her childhood is supposed to be the happiest time of her life, and on her 10th birthday she tells Jenny Gray as much. The two girls agree that unlike Miss Brodie, their parents didn't have primes, only sexual intercourse, which was still a stupendous thought to them, one they had only lately lit upon. Sandy goes on to say that Mr. Lloyd, the one-armed art master to the senior girls at Blaine, has just had a baby, and she infers from this that he must have committed sex with his wife. While the girls continue discussing sex together, Sandy's English mother, all the other schoolgirls' mothers are Scottish, enters the room and asks if all is well, only to be driven away by a ferocious glance from Sandy. Sandy then pulls out a notebook stashed away in her room, the first page of which bore the title The Mountain Airy. The notebook holds a story written by Sandy and Jenny about Miss Brodie's dead lover Hugh, whom the girls have imagined to be alive. In the story, Hugh returns from the war and seeks out Miss Brodie, only to be told she has taken another lover. In turn, Hugh flees to an eyrie in the mountains, where Sandy and Jenny come upon him. He holds both captive. The story leaves off at the point at which Jenny escapes. Hugh pursues her, and Sandy tells him that Miss Brodie has not in fact taken another lover. Sandy and Jenny resume work on the story, describing how the fictionalized Hugh flings Sandy away to pursue Jenny. The girls discuss the prospect of publishing their story when in their primes, then pretend to be witches, plan on going to an art gallery together to see the statue of a naked Greek god, speculate that Miss Brodie will escort them, and agree that she, Miss Brodie, is above sex. It is soon time for Jenny to go home. As she and her mother leave, Sandy looks out the window and wonders if Jenny shares her feeling of living a double life. The narrative shifts to Miss Brodie's classroom. It is close to the end of the school day, and Miss Brodie is reciting Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. Sandy, leading her double life to stave off boredom, is daydreaming that the Lady of Shalott herself has written the poem she exists in with white paint left out by some heedless member of the unemployed. Also that the lady tells her, Sandy, that she is to be ill-fated in love. Upon this, Sandy cries out in alarm in real life. Miss Brodie asks if Sandy is in pain, tells the girls that composure is one of a woman's best assets, and then supports her case by gesturing to a print of the ever-composed Mona Lisa, a painting by Da Vinci. Miss Brodie invites Sandy to recite some poetry with her famous half-English vowels, and the narrator informs us that by this point Rose Stanley is not yet famous for sex. In fact, it is Eunice Gardiner who broaches the subject of sex with Sandy and Jenny by pointing out a sexual phrase in the Bible, which induces them to threaten to tell on her. Jenny, however, is famous at this point for her prettiness and her singing. Indeed, the long-bodied, short-legged, red and gold-haired Mr. Lowther, the girls' singing teacher, sometimes twitches her ringlets as she sings, even while Miss Brodie looks on. One day after singing class, Miss Brodie gathers her class about her and tells them, "You girls are my vocation. I am dedicated to you in my prime." She then instructs the girls to walk in the composed manner of Sybil Thorndike, a famous English actress. Sandy does so to such an extent that Miss Brodie thinks her walk a parody and chastises her for having a frivolous nature. Back at the classroom, Rose Stanley reports to Miss Brodie that she, Rose, has ink on her blouse. Miss Brodie sends her to have it removed by the science teacher to the senior girls, Miss Lockhart. Sandy even goes so far once in a while as to intentionally spill ink on her clothing at carefully calculated intervals because she so enjoys going to Miss Lockhart's classroom, where she once saw a lesson in progress that had such order and discipline and productivity that it deeply impressed her as opposed to the freedom of Miss Brodie's class. After Rose, in the present case, returns to the classroom, Miss Brodie asserts that art is greater than science. This is in 1931, during the first of 2 winters that the girls spend with Miss Brodie, who has already selected her favorites, the girls who would make up the Brodie set, whom she swore to secrecy before telling them about her personal life and professional feud with Miss McKay. Eunice Gardiner is at first very quiet, and it is strange that she joins the Brodie set at all. Eventually, though, she amuses her peers and Miss Brodie herself by doing cartwheels on the carpet. Miss Brodie calls her, in Ariel, a spirit in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. After that, Eunice becomes chatty and continues to entertain, though she is not allowed to do cartwheels on Sundays, for in many ways Miss Brodie was an Edinburgh spinster of the deepest dye. Some 28 years after she did the splits in Miss Brodie's apartment, Eunice, who has become a nurse and married a doctor by now, tells her husband while the two are at home one evening that when they visit Edinburgh for the festival, he should remind her to visit Miss Brodie's grave. The two proceed to discuss Miss Brodie, whom Eunice claims was sane as anything. She also tells her husband that Miss Brodie died after World War II, after being betrayed by an unknown member of the Brodie set and forced to retire. The narrator says that it is now time to discuss a long walk Miss Brodie leads her favorites on through the old parts of Edinburgh, one Friday in March. Sandy is walking alongside Mary McGregor because Jenny is absent from the outing. Sandy is daydreaming about assisting Alan Breck, a Scottish rebel whom Sandy is familiar with after reading Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Kidnapped. Miss Brodie encourages Mary to speak with Sandy, but Mary says that Sandy won't speak with her. Miss Brodie replies, "Sandy cannot talk to you if you are so stupid and disagreeable." As they walk, Sandy nags at Mary for staring at an Indian student, then for lagging behind and for having poor posture. When an impulse to be kind to Mary comes over her, Sandy hears Miss Brodie's voice, which arrested the urge. Sandy understands then that the girls are a body with Miss Brodie at the head, obedient to the destiny of Miss Brodie herself, as if God had willed them to birth for that purpose. She becomes frightened of being kind to Mary then, since doing so would separate her from the group. She resumes nagging Mary, with the feeling that if you did a thing a lot of times, you made it into a right thing. The Brodie set and Miss Brodie arrive at the Meadows, a large public park, where they pass a group of Girl Guides, or Girl Scout brownies. Miss Brodie's students ask her about whether they should join the brownies and guides, but she implies that it is not for the creme de la creme. Sandy recalls to herself just then Miss Brodie's admiration for Mussolini's marching troops, the fascisti, who Miss Brodie has a picture of. Mussolini and his fascisti had put an end to unemployment, Sandy recalls, and it also occurs to her that the Brodie set is like Miss Brodie's fascisti, and that the girl guides are too much of a rival fascisti for Miss Brodie to bear. Sandy thinks about joining the brownies for a moment before group fright seized her again. She loved Miss Brodie. The girls and Miss Brodie pass through the slums of the old town, then to the great square of the grass market. Miss Brodie comments that the Scots owe a lot to the French. As they walk, Sandy feels as though she's in a different country, full of new smells, new shapes, and poor people. The girls hold hands nervously. They see a man proposing to a woman, ringed in by a crowd. Throughout her life, speaking with other people raised in Edinburgh, Sandy is shocked to think about how little she has seen of Edinburgh, how little she has seen of the 1930s. The narrative flash-forwards. Sandy, in middle age, is a nun called Sister Helena. She has published a famous psychological treatise, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, and is therefore allowed, as no other nuns are, to have visitors. A young man visiting her, speaking with her through a grill, asks her about her formative influences, the poets W.H. Auden or T.S. Eliot, the Spanish Civil War, Calvinism, a branch of Christianity. Sister Helena responds that it is none other than Miss Jean Brodie. The narrative shifts back to the long walk Sandy and the rest of the Brodie set are having with Miss Brodie through Edinburgh. As they pass St. Giles's Cathedral, the narrator explains that the girls, brought up per several different Christian denominations, once asked Miss Brodie about religion, and she, though adhering to the strict Church of Scotland habits of her youth, introduced atheism to them, which she herself had learned about having recently taken a course in comparative religion at the university. The walk now has brought the girls and their teacher to Chambers Street. There Miss Brodie explains that she and Miss McKay are scheduled to meet, presumably because Miss McKay wants to question Miss Brodie's methods of instruction. Miss Brodie explains to the girls that her conception of education, from the Latin roots e-out and duco lead, is a leading out of what is already in a girl's soul. In contrast, she describes Miss McKay as intruding into girls' minds. Miss Brodie also tells the girls that Miss McKay has accused her of putting ideas into her students' heads. Never let it be said that I put ideas into your heads, she instructs them before quizzing the daydreaming Sandy on what education is. The walk continues. Rose Stanley points out a French car. Miss Brodie chastises her for having a mind full of motor cars and for not paying attention to her conversation. Sandy, meanwhile, is fantasizing about dinner with Alan Breck, but is disturbed to think of being passionately swept away into having intercourse with him. Surely people have time to think before being swept away, she wonders. She also imagines that it would be rude for people to take their clothes off in front of one another, which she hopes prevents them from getting swept away by passion. The narrator goes on to state that Miss Brodie would later be amazed, awed, and enthused by Rose's playing the role of the great lover, during that time when she became famous for sex. Miss Brodie is not explicitly speaking to the girls about sex just yet, however. Miss Brodie continues speaking of Miss McKay, defending her own methods, encouraging her girls to study hard for their end-of-term examinations, and claiming that no one could accuse her of impropriety unless one of her girls betrayed her and distorted the truth. Rose says, Miss McKay has an awfully red face with the veins all showing, but Miss Brodie chastises her, saying it would be disloyal were she, Miss Brodie, to permit talk like that of her superior. As the walkers arrive at the end of Lauriston Place, they see a line of unemployed men. Miss Brodie explains the men were waiting for their share of money from the Labor Bureau, which some would spend on drink instead of food for their families. Miss Brodie tells her girls to pray for these men, and reminds them that Italy had no unemployment problem. Sandy becomes frightened looking at the unemployed men, then thinks of their starving children and wants to cry. She wishes Jenny were with her, because Jenny cried easily about poor children. Sandy turns to Mary then, and tells her to stop pushing, even though Mary claims not to be pushing at all. The long walk is over. Sandy decides not to go to Miss Brodie's for tea, but instead takes the tramcar home. Later, however, When she thinks about Eunice doing somersaults and splits in Miss Brodie's kitchen, she wishes she had gone to tea after all. She then takes out her notebook which holds The Mountain Airy, the true love story of Miss Bean Brodie, and adds a chapter to it. Chapter 3. The narrator says that Miss Brodie is not unique at this point in her prime, and that there are legions of her kind during the 1930s, progressive spinsters interested in art and social welfare, assistants with the Scottish nationalist movement, feminists who spoke with men man-to-man. Miss Brodie is unique only in that the women like her aren't, for the most part, school teachers, who tend to be of a more orderly type. Miss Brodie is also unique because she trusts herself to change her mind and learn, even on ethical question. Even in her prime, Miss Brodie is developing, growing. The narrative reopens in 1931, a year into Miss Brodie's prime. For the girls in the Brodie set, sex is at this time the be-all and end-all. A suntanned Miss Brodie opens the term by discussing her trip to London and Italy, praising Mussolini as one of the greatest men in the world. Miss McKay enters the classroom and encourages the girls to have a good year. After Miss McKay leaves her classroom, Miss Brodie restates that an education is a leading out, calls Mary stupid for not knowing what the word nasally means, and exults over having seen the Colosseum in Rome where gladiators hailed Caesar, among other things. She also gives the girls apples from Mr. Lowther's orchard. The only thing, it would seem, that Miss Brodie doesn't do is to discuss history, which is what her girls are supposed to be studying. Even before the official opening of her prime, Miss Brodie's colleagues at the junior school had been turning against her, all save Mr. Gordon Lowther and Mr. Teddy Lloyd, the only men on the staff. Both were already a little in love with Miss Brodie, and have subconsciously begun to act as rivals for her attention. The girls in the Brodie set realize that Mr. Lowther and Mr. Lloyd are romantically interested in their teacher before Miss Brodie herself does. Though Mr. Lowther and Mr. Lloyd look like one another, both having red gold coloring, habitual acquaintance proves otherwise. Mr. Lloyd, the art master, is more handsome and more sophisticated, rumored to be half Welsh, half English. He paints with his right arm. He lost his left during World War I. Miss Brodie's class has up to this point had only one opportunity to size up Mr. Lloyd closely, during an art lesson with Miss Brodie in attendance. The scene is this. Mr. Lloyd is tracing with his pointer the lines of a painting by Botticelli, The Primavera. The schoolgirls can't suppress their laughter when he traces the lines of the painted lady's bottoms. Miss Brodie calls the girls Philistines, that is, ignorant of artistic value. Sandy continues laughing, and Miss Brodie chastises her. Mary also continues laughing. She would not have laughed at all had the other girls not laughed, for she was too stupid, the narrator says, to have any sex wits of her own. Nonetheless, Miss Brodie takes Mary by the arm and shuts her out of the room. Mr. Lloyd then continues the lesson, turning to a painting of Madonna and Child without any sense of religious awe, only a very artistic attitude, which surprises the religious girls. He turns to Miss Brodie to see if she approves of this attitude, and she smiles, as would a goddess with superior understanding smile to a god. It is not long after this that Monica Douglas reports to the Brodie set that she saw Mr. Lloyd kiss Miss Brodie. The other girls don't really believe her, however, and question her over details, like when the kiss occurred, where, and how long it lasted. Sandy, most dissatisfied with Monica's account, reenacts the kiss several times to test its plausibility. When Miss Brodie enters the classroom during the fourth of these reenactments, she asks Sandy what she was doing. Only playing, the girl says. All through the term till Christmas, the Brodie set continues to question whether Miss Brodie is capable of being kissed, and kissing they decide, at last, to keep the incident a secret. Meanwhile, Miss Brodie changes. She wears newer clothes and an amber necklace, and the girls watch her belly for signs of swelling. The other junior teachers have begun to say good morning to Miss Brodie more graciously at this time as well, but still with an edge of scorn. The only two teachers who do not judge Miss Brodie at all are the two sewing teachers, Miss Ellen and Allison Kerr, who think all of their colleagues who teach academic subjects to be above criticism. During her class's sewing lessons, Miss Brodie reads aloud from the novel Jane Eyre while her girls, listening, prick their thumbs so that interesting little spots of blood might appear on the stuff they were sewing. Singing lessons with Mr. Lowther are different now, for Miss Brodie seems agitated before, during, and after them. She also wears her newest clothes on singing days. Sandy continues to disbelieve that Monica had seen Miss Brodie kiss Mr. Lloyd. In fact, only Rose, who is not at all and never will be curious about sex, believes Monica. However, later in the 1950s, when Monica visits Sandy at the convent and comments once again that as a girl she had seen Mr. Lloyd kiss Miss Brodie, Sandy says, "I know you did." The narrative shifts back in time. Sandy knew about the kiss even before Miss Brodie tells her about it one day after the end of the war in the 1940s. Sandy and Miss Brodie are eating at the Braid Hills Hotel. Miss Brodie has been forced to retire by this point and is by her own admission past her prime. She tells Sandy that Teddy Lloyd had loved her greatly, but that she had renounced him because he was married, even though the two share what Miss Brodie calls the artistic nature. During this post-war meal with Sandy, Miss Brodie also recalls the time when in the autumn of 1931 she took a leave of absence, seemingly on account of illness. In her place, the gaunt Miss Gaunt taught her class, far more rigorously and demandingly, to the girls' shock. Even the sewing teachers Miss Ellen and Allison Kerr felt cowed by Miss Gaunt. Sandy and Jenny used to giggle watching the shuttles of the sewing machines go up and down, which reminded them of sex, but Miss Gaunt's presence had a definite subtracting effect from the sexual significance of everything. Sandy recalls to herself that, during one sewing class, Miss Gaunt discussed her brother with Miss Ellen and Allison Kerr, who was the minister of the parish church the three women attended, a fact which made the Kerr sisters nervous around Miss Gaunt. Meanwhile, Sandy was daydreaming about being in love with Mr. Edward Rochester, a character from the novel Jane Eyre. She was distracted when Miss Gaunt mentioned that Mr. Lowther was not at school that week, ill like Miss Brodie. Sandy further recalls to herself that, to break up the sexless gloom imposed by Miss Gaunt, she hypothesized with Jenny that Miss Brodie was having a love affair not with Mr. Lloyd but Mr. Lowther, and Jenny in particular imagined how the two teachers would initiate sexual intercourse together. They paused their conversation when Eunice Gardiner came over, for Eunice had taken a religious turn, albeit a short-lived one, and therefore was not to be trusted. The narrative returns to the 1940s, to the meal Miss Brodie and Sandy are sharing at the Braid Hills Hotel. Miss Brodie goes on to tell Sandy that, since she renounced Mr. Lloyd, the love of her prime, she began an affair with Mr. Lowther as a cure. Sandy doubts, however, that this is the whole story. As the meal progresses, Miss Brodie eventually returns to wondering which of the Brodie set betrayed her, thereby forcing her to retire. Was it Mary? Rose? It is 7 years, thought Sandy, since I betrayed this tiresome woman. What does she mean by betray? Back in 1931, after her 2 weeks' absence, Miss Brodie returns to her teaching post, thereby relieving Miss Gaunt of her duties. Mr. Lowther's singing class goes on as usual, Miss Brodie now playing the accompaniment on the piano. Mr. Lowther no longer plays with Jenny's curls. Sandy is almost sure that Mr. Lowther loves Miss Brodie and that Miss Brodie loves Mr. Lloyd. The narrator also foreshadows here, although only vaguely, that Rose Stanley later becomes involved in the love affair between Miss Brodie and Mr. Lloyd. During the Easter term, the junior girls have to decide whether they will study on the modern or classical side at the senior school. Miss Brodie, insisting the girls make the choice of their own free will, insinuates a strong preference for the classical side. Only Eunice from the Brodie set considers going on the modern side. Eunice is too pious at this time for Miss Brodie's liking. When she opts to go to a social gathering rather than accompany Miss Brodie and the set to the Empire Theater to watch the world-famous Russian ballerina Anna Pavlova dance in Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, Miss Brodie criticizes Eunice for allegedly misusing the word social, and implies that Eunice would be missing out on watching a great moment in eternity, all that term Sandy daydreams about dancing with Anna Pavlova. The narrative rapidly shifts forward to a few weeks before Miss Brodie's death. She is in a nursing home and learns then from Monica Douglas that Sandy had gone to a convent to become a nun. Miss Brodie wonders whether Sandy did that to annoy her, and also wonders whether it might be Sandy who had betrayed her. The narrative jumps back to the Easter, spring, term of 1931, when the girls are deciding whether to go to the modern or classical side. Miss McKay, at that point the headmistress, who favors the modern side, invites Sandy, Jenny, and Mary over for tea to discuss the decision with them. Mary's grades are too low for her to go to the classical side, which makes her despondent given Miss Brodie's preference for the classical. Despite Miss McKay's appeals, Sandy and Jenny also opt for the classical side, and their grades permit it. Miss McKay then begins speaking generously of Miss Brodie, with the goal of pumping incriminating facts about her out of Sandy, Jenny, and Mary. Miss McKay asks about the girls' cultural interests, which Mary reports to be stories. When the headmistress goes on to ask what subjects Miss Brodie discusses in her stories, Sandy and Jenny, too readily, as though with premeditation, reply, history. After Miss McKay excuses the girls, they report back to Miss Brodie some, but not all of this conversation. Toward the end of the Easter holidays, Jenny is walking out alone by the Water of Leith, a river in Scotland, when a man calls her over and exposes his genitalia to her. She runs away unharmed, unpursued, to be soon surrounded by horrified family members. A policewoman comes in to question Jenny about the incident. These events cause quite a stir among the Brodie set. Sandy, just on the verge of obtaining permission to take walks alone, is denied permission after all. However, the events also provide the girls much to discuss, namely, the man who exposed himself and the policewoman. Indeed, Sandy stops daydreaming about Alan Breck and Mr. Rochester and instead falls in love with this policewoman, whom she questions Jenny about with enthusiasm. Sandy is troubled, though, that the policewoman in real life pronounced the word nasty as nesty. Nonetheless, Sandy continues to daydream about serving on the force with the policewoman, whom she names in her imagination Sergeant and Gray. Sandy, picking up police jargon by reading the Sunday paper, pretends to be on the force with Sergeant Gray, with the mission of eliminating sex altogether. Sandy even confides in her imaginary partner that the two need to look into Miss Brodie's liaison with Gordon Lowther. Sandy and Jenny also begin composing a fictionalized love correspondence between Miss Brodie and Mr. Lowther. Back at school after the Easter holidays, Sandy and Jenny keep secret the Water of Leith affair. One morning, Sandy even goes so far as to ask Jenny to keep it a secret from Miss Brodie. Her reasons for this request are motivated by something that happened earlier that day. Miss Brodie specifically sent Rose to help Mr. Lloyd carry art supplies back to the classroom, and it occurred to Jenny and Sandy that Rose looked different. They speculated that she had had her first menstrual cycle. The girls end up forgetting about the man who exposed himself and focus more and more on the policewoman as the term went on. During the last few months of her teaching the Brodie girls at Blaine, Miss Brodie makes herself adorable. No bickering and no irritability save with Mary. Class is often held outside on benches under an elm, and Miss Brodie elaborates on her love story with the soldier Hugh, claiming for the first time that he was also a talented singer and painter. "I think the painter was the real Hugh," she says. It becomes clear to Sandy and Jenny, as they discuss it alone, that Miss Brodie was fitting her old love story about Hugh to her new one involving Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Lowther. Sandy admires this narrative technique, but also feels a pressing need to prove Miss Brodie guilty of misconduct. That spring, we also learn from the narrator, Jenny's mother is expecting a baby. During a short vacation, while visiting Jenny's aunt in the coastal town of Crail in the Scottish region of Fife, Sandy and Jenny complete their fictionalized love correspondence between Miss Brodie and Mr. Lowther. At the mouth of a cave, they have written the last of it, where they struggle to put their teacher in both a favorable and an unfavorable light. They have imagined a sexual encounter between Miss Brodie and Mr. Lowther set on a storm-embattled Scottish peak called Arthur's Seat, and conclude their series of letters with one in which the fictionalized Miss Brodie declines Mr. Lowther's marriage proposal and, among other things, congratulates her lover warmly upon his sexual intercourse as well as singing. After completing the love correspondence, Sandy and Jenny read it from end to end, and wonder whether they should cast it out to sea or bury it. They at last decide to bury it, and never saw it again. They walk back to Crail then, full of plans and joy. Chapter 4. By the time the chapter opens, Miss Brodie's girls have become students in the senior school, a new life altogether. The senior school teachers are all very nice, and they treat the girls not as personalities but as students. Miss Lockhart, the science teacher, dramatically opens class by saying she holds enough gunpowder in her hand to blow up the school. The girls appreciate senior life at first, as well as the dazzling new subjects they study, including geometry and, on the classical side, Greek. However, a few weeks in, the party game effect of that first week of senior school instruction fades. Miss Lockhart, the senior school science teacher, is like a mysterious priest to the girls, with her dangerous chemicals and lab equipment. During the first week of the term, the girls conduct an experiment in which they ignited magnesium. Mary is so frightened that she runs in panic from flame to flame until Miss Lockhart calms her down and tells her not to be so stupid. Once, years later, when Rose Stanley is visiting Sandy at the convent, she tells the nun, "When any ill befalls me, I wish I had been nicer to Mary." The narrator immediately shows us once more the scene in which Miss Brodie, dining with Sandy at the Braid Hills Hotel, wonders if it was Mary who betrayed her. "Perhaps I should have been kinder to Mary," Miss Brodie says on that occasion. The Brodie set might easily have lost its identity at this time, both because Miss Brodie is no longer a constant presence in their lives, and also because Miss McKay attempts to break the girls up. She permits Mary, who had wanted to go on to the classical side but had been unable because of her poor grades, the opportunity to take Latin implicitly in exchange for information concerning Miss Brodie. However, Mary does not understand what Miss McKay wants of her, thinking all the teachers in league together, Miss Brodie and all. Miss McKay lays yet another scheme, but this one undid her. At the senior school, there are 4 houses and a system in place that encourages competition between the houses. Miss McKay places the Brodie girls in different houses as much as is possible, to separate them and force them into competition with one another. Team spirit is greatly emphasized at Blaine. However, Miss Brodie has trained her girls, perhaps in preparation for their separation, to think that team spirit undercuts individualism, love, and loyalty. Miss Brodie also gave the girls examples of women who rejected team spirit, from Shakespeare's Cleopatra to Helen of Troy, from the actress Sybil Thorndike to the dancer Pavlova. It is impossible to know whether Miss Brodie planned to keep her set together, or if she just worked by instinct, but she succeeds. The girls who had passed through her hands avoid the playing grounds except under compulsion, all save Eunice Gardiner, who is too good an athlete not to compete. On most Saturday afternoons during this period, Miss Brodie entertains her set over tea. She tells them that her new pupils do not have much potential, which makes her girls feel chosen. Miss Brodie also inquires about Teddy Lloyd, who teaches the girls' art class. The girls tell her about their first day, when Mr. Lloyd, irritated by how relaxed and chatty and giggly the girls were, smashed a saucer on the floor and told Rose Stanley, whose profile he seemed to admire, to pick it up. Jenny commented to Sandy when Mr. Lloyd smashed the saucer that Miss Brodie had good taste in men. Upon being told of the incident and what Mr. Lloyd had said of Rose's profile, Miss Brodie looks at Rose in a special way. The narrator tells us that, since moving on to the senior school, Sandy and Jenny's interest in Miss Brodie's love life has moved from being absolutely sexually charged to being a question of plumbing the deep heart's core. Indeed, now that her mother has given birth to another child and she herself is 12, Jenny can say with truth that she has moved past interest in sexual research. It is only later, the narrator says fast-forwarding, when Jenny is a 40-year-old actress 16 years into marriage, that her buoyant and airy discovery of sex returns to her, while she is in Rome standing next to a man she didn't know well. This memory still happily astonishes her, and gives her a sense of the hidden possibilities in all things. One Saturday over tea, Miss Brodie tells the girls that Mr. Lowther's housekeeper has left him, and that she disliked the housekeeper anyway because she, the housekeeper, allegedly resented Miss Brodie's position as Mr. Lowther's friend and confidant. The next Saturday, Miss Brodie tells the girls that Miss Ellen and Allison Kerr have temporarily taken on the role of housekeepers for Mr. Lowther, and she criticizes them for their inquisitiveness and being too much in with Miss Gaunt and the Church of Scotland. In addition to hosting tea on Saturdays, Miss Brodie also sets aside an hour during which she has Sandy and Jenny teach her the Greek they are learning in class. She progresses in the language, although Sandy and Jenny give her different information about the accents. Miss Brodie is determined to share in her special girls' new life, and what she cannot influence she scorns, like their instruction in geometry, which she regards as merely needlessly clever. What need had Sybil Thorndike or Anna Pavlova or Helen of Troy for mathematics, after all? Nonetheless, the girls are dazzled by their new subjects, and would be until in later years the fields of science and math lost their elemental strangeness in the young women's minds. For now, though, the girls are so dazzled that Miss Brodie struggles to retain influence over her set. She knows that her main concern is ensuring that none of her special girls should become personally attached to any of their senior teachers. But these teachers seem so indifferent to the girls that Miss Brodie refrains from directly attacking them. In the spring of 1933, Miss Brodie's Greek lessons with Sandy and Ginny come to an end. The Kerr sisters have begun to enjoy caring for Mr. Lowther and have never been so perky or useful in their lives, especially since the time of their sister's death, mentioned only here in the novel. Miss Gaunt, who has in a sense taken the place of this dead sister, encourages the two women to make the arrangement with Mr. Lowther permanent. Up to now, Miss Brodie has visited Mr. Lowther at his house in Craymond on Sundays. On that day, she also went to church, rotating over time from denomination to denomination, sect to sect. The only church she disapproves of is the Roman Catholic Church, which is perhaps the only church that could have embraced and disciplined her soaring and diving spirit. She asserts that it is a church founded on superstition, and she so strongly believes that God supports her no matter what that she feels guiltless about her wrongdoing anyway, even while going to bed with Mr. Lowther. The Brodie girls are exhilarated by their former teacher's attitude of self-forgiveness, and only in retrospect recognize its amorality. However, even later on, after Miss Brodie has died, Sandy comes to recognize that Miss Brodie's defective sense of self-criticism had not been without its beneficent and enlarging effects. When it becomes clear that the Kerr sisters have permanently taken up housekeeping for Mr. Lowther, Miss Brodie fancies that her lover is getting thin because of their skimpiness in caring for him. In fact, it is Miss Brodie who is getting thin. So she begins going to Craymond on Saturdays to supervise them. This is what ends the Greek lessons. Miss Brodie is encouraged in this action by her special girls, and the Kerr sisters take her intrusion meekly. Miss Brodie also invites her girls in pairs up to Craymond on Saturdays to spend the afternoon with her in Mr. Lowther's residence. The girls notice that Mr. Lowther calls their teacher Jean, a fact they kept to themselves. Miss Brodie exults in her victory over the Kerr sisters. She attributes it, in a discussion with Sandy and Jenny, to her ancestry. She explains that she is a descendant of Willie Brodie, a cabinet maker and designer of gallows, a member of the town council of Edinburgh with two mistresses who bore him 5 children between them. Willie was arrested for robbing the excise office, motivated not by money but the exciting danger of burglary. He was imprisoned for the crime, and later died on a gallows of his own devising in 1788. This is the stuff Miss Brodie is made of, and accounted in her mind for her victory. Sandy begins to consider not only the question of Miss Brodie's desirability from a man's perspective, but also whether she could sexually surrender herself to Mr. Lowther, especially given that she is, though thinner than before, nonetheless larger than him. For example, before he touches anything in his home, Mr. Lowther would look to Miss Brodie as if for approval, which leads the Brodie girls to assume that Lowther's mother had been a rather oppressive woman. During the girls' visits to Craymond, Miss Brodie asks them many questions about Mr. Lloyd, including about his wife Mrs. Deirdre Lloyd and children, while Mr. Lowther eats looking mournfully on, fattening up at Miss Brodie's insistence. Mr. Lloyd is a Roman Catholic, she explains to Mr. Lowther one day, hence his many children, 6 in all including lots of babies. Sandy and Jenny report that Mrs. Lloyd is either past her prime or would never have one. At the end of each Saturday in Craymond with the girls, Miss Brodie always makes it seem as if she returned to Edinburgh instead of staying the nights with Mr. Lowther. While the Brodie girls never discover evidence as to whether or not Miss Brodie stays the night with Mr. Lowther, Miss Ellen Kerr supposes she has. A nightdress allegedly belonging to Miss Brodie stashed under Mr. Lowther's pillow. At Miss Gaunt's urging, Miss Kerr tells Miss McKay about this discovery, but Miss McKay shrewdly reasons that there is no way to prove that the nightdress does in fact belong to Miss Brodie. Nonetheless, urged on by his sister Miss Gaunt, the parish minister advises Mr. Lowther to withdraw from his positions of choirmaster and elder at the church. Sandy later learns about the nightdress when she, moved by other considerations, betrays Miss Brodie to Miss McKay. One night in the summer of 1933, Sandy and Jenny are at Mr. Lowther's house at Craymond while Miss Brodie prepares a great ham. She asks them, as she often did, about Mr. Lloyd, and they tell her about two portraits in his studio, an amusingly serious one of his family, and one of Rose Stanley, who has been modeling for him. This is exciting to Miss Brodie, as is the fact that Mr. Lloyd only invites the Brodie girls to his studio. Miss Brodie explains to Sandy and Jenny that this is because these girls were of my stamp and cut. On a joint impulse, Sandy and Jenny decide then to run along the beach. When they return to Mr. Lowther's house, they listen to Miss Brodie speak of her forthcoming holiday to Germany, for she admires Hitler, the Chancellor of Germany at that point, very much, thinking him a prophet figure and even more efficient than Mussolini. For their summer holidays, Sandy and Jenny go to a farm, where they don't think much on Miss Brodie, but instead make hay and follow the sheep about. Chapter 5. 15 years old at this time, Sandy stands with Mr. Lloyd in his studio admiring the portrait he has done of Rose Stanley in her gym tunic. Strangely, Rose's face in the portrait resembles that of Miss Brodie. Mrs. Deirdre Lloyd, also present and dressed fashionably like a peasant, tells her husband to show Sandy red velvet, a portrait of Sandy wrapped in a swathing of crimson velvet, which makes her look one-armed like Mr. Lloyd and more physically developed than in life. Sandy is surprised to learn that Mr. Lloyd has also painted Monica Douglas and Eunice Gardiner. Both images resemble Miss Brodie, which is not true of any of Mr. Lloyd's portraits of people not in the Brodie set. At this point, it seems to Sandy that the Brodie set might split up, which she thinks perhaps a good thing. While they are together in his studio, however, Mr. Lloyd confides in Sandy that he desires to paint all the Brodie girls, individually and then all together. Sandy thinks this an attempt to keep the girls a set despite their emerging individuality. She retorts, "We'd look like one big Miss Brodie," and gazes at Mr. Lloyd insolently. He laughs, kisses her long and wetly, and as she tries to run out of the studio he tells her, "You're just about the ugliest little thing I've ever seen in my life." Sandy then follows Mr. Lloyd downstairs, where she spends most of tea trying to understand her feelings about him kissing and insulting her. She is distracted, however, by the Lloyd children's loudness, and by the Lloyds themselves, who both request that Sandy call them by their first names. Mrs. Lloyd asks Sandy to bring Miss Brodie to tea, but Teddy is resistant to the idea. Mr. Lloyd then asks Sandy about Miss Brodie's relationship with Mr. Lowther. What does she see in him? Sandy replies sharply, "He sings to her." Mrs. Lloyd laughs and said that Miss Brodie sounds a bit queer. Mr. Lloyd defends her and leaves the room, after which Sandy excuses herself too. The narrative shifts back to around the time when Miss Ellen Kerr discovers what she believes to be Miss Brodie's nightdress in Mr. Lowther's house. Mr. Lowther over the past 2 years has considered marrying either one of the Kerr sisters, because Miss Brodie continually refuses to marry him. She would only make love with and cook for him. Mr. Lowther broods on the possibility that she prefers Mr. Lloyd's long legs to his short ones. Miss Brodie confides most of this in her girls as they grow from 13 to 14, 14 to 15, without ever stating or suggesting that she is sleeping with Mr. Lowther, for she is still determining which of the girls she can trust, and wants to alarm no parental suspicions. However, she finds in Sandy a girl in whom she can confide entirely. In fact, in the autumn of 1935, while the two golf together, Miss Brodie tells Sandy that all of her ambitions are fixed on her and Rose. She asks Sandy if it seems that Jenny is becoming a bit insipid, and Sandy agrees. Miss Brodie goes on to criticize all the Brodie girls, Sandy and Rose excluded. Meanwhile, Sandy recalls to herself having seen Miss Lockhart golfing one Saturday with Mr. Lowther. The scene closes with Miss Brodie praising Sandy for her insight and Rose for her instinct. She also claims that she herself possesses both of these qualities. Also around this time, Sandy would stand outside St. Giles's Cathedral or the toll booth, an old municipal building in Edinburgh, and think about Calvinism, which had been spoken of only as a joke during her childhood, and which she feels deprived of. Sandy thinks that the Calvinists Miss Gaunt and the Kerr sisters are the most real and rooted people she knows, which she attributes to their belief in the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, which holds that God elects people to be sent to heaven without reference to their conduct on earth. Sandy also senses Calvinism to be a formative influence on Miss Brodie herself. Instead of being or not being elected by God to salvation, Miss Brodie had elected herself to grace. Sandy also develops what she thinks of as Miss Brodie's plan, unfolding over many years. Rose, with her instinct, is to have a love affair with Mr. Lloyd, as a great lover above the common moral code, and Sandy, with her insight, is to act as the informant on the affair. However, the narrator flashes forward and reveals that Mr. Lloyd has no more than a professional interest in Rose, and that it is Sandy who eventually has the affair with him, with Rose as the informant. It was some time, however, before these things would come to pass. In the interim, Miss Brodie discusses art with Sandy and Rose and tells Rose that she has to realize the power within and fulfill herself, which she predicts will happen in Rose's 17th or 18th year. Rose is also becoming famous for sex, not because she talks about or indulges in sex, but because she is popular with the boys. Teddy Lloyd completes a portrait of all the girls, whom in a magical transfiguration, all resemble Miss Brodie on Mr. Lloyd's canvas. He paints Rose often because she is instinctively a good model, and because she requires the money he gives her to fund her addiction to the cinema. Sandy feels warmly toward Miss Brodie when she sees how misled she is in her idea of Rose, who is not as sexually adventurous as Miss Brodie thinks. Later in life, after she has become a nun, Sandy never feels more affection for Miss Brodie than when she thought upon Miss Brodie as silly. Even so, the Brodie girls are still considered by their classmates to be lacking in team spirit and to be a social unit unto themselves. Were other people not to perceive them as such, the girls would no doubt have gone each her own way by the time they had reached the age of 16. But the girls do not drift apart, not least because they find their position enviable. They are reputed to have more fun than other girls, and this is the truth. Miss Brodie also rallies her special girls around her each time her teaching methods are opposed by the school authorities. She tells her girls that if those authorities do not dismiss her on the grounds of her educational methods, they will attempt to dismiss her through slander. She defends her relationship with Mr. Lowther as a close friendship, even though she has neglected him of late. Sandy thinks that this is so because Miss Brodie's sexual feelings are satisfied by proxy, as her plan for Rose to become Mr. Lloyd's lover reaches fulfillment. Miss Brodie claims that, if she wished, she could marry Mr. Lowther tomorrow. The morning after Miss Brodie makes this announcement, however, it is reported in the newspaper The Scotsman that Mr. Lowther has become engaged to Miss Lockhart. Nobody expected it, and Miss Brodie feels betrayed. The term following, Miss Brodie puts her spare energy into her plan for Rose to become Mr. Lloyd's lover and for Sandy to become her informant on the affair. What energy she had to spare from that, the narrator says, she now put into political ideas. Chapter 6. The headmistress of Blaine, Miss McKay, never gives up on indirectly pumping the Brodie girls for incriminating evidence on Miss Brodie, but now, 7 years into their friendship with her, the girls cannot incriminate their former teacher without incriminating themselves at the same time. One time Miss McKay tries to trick Sandy into betraying that Miss Brodie drinks too much. But Miss Brodie really doesn't drink much at all, and Sandy says as much. One of Miss Brodie's greatest admirers is Joyce Emily Hammond, a very rich and delinquent girl sent to Blaine as a last resort. She does not act like a delinquent at Blaine, however. Because Joyce Emily has been enrolled in and ejected or removed from so many schools recently, her parents request that they not buy Blaine uniforms for her till a trial period has elapsed. This is granted, and so Joyce Emily goes about in dark green while the other girls wear deep violet. She boasts of having 5 sets of discarded uniforms in her closet, along with hair she cut from one of her past governess's heads, a post office savings book taken from a past governess, and a burnt pillowcase which Joyce Emily set fire to while a governess's head rested on it. Joyce Emily very much wants to attach herself to the Brodie set, but those girls disapprove of her because of her green clothes and her shiny car and chauffeur. Besides, they are busy studying for examinations and doing other school activities. In fact, nobody wants Joyce Emily less than the Brodie girls, who are among the brightest in the school. The fact of the Brodie set's intelligence, of course, makes it all the more difficult for Miss McKay to discredit Miss Brodie. Moreover, the Brodie girls have outside interests, too. At this point in their lives in 1937, Eunice has a boyfriend. Monica and Mary take groceries to people living in slums. Jenny is acting. Rose models for Teddy Lloyd, sometimes accompanied by Sandy, who toys with the idea of inducing Mr. Lloyd to kiss her again. The girls also visit Miss Brodie in small groups and all together, so they have little time for Joyce Emily. Miss Brodie, however, does make time for Joyce Emily. The Brodie girls resent this. but are also relieved that Miss Brodie takes Joyce Emily to tea and the theater alone, without obliging them to share Joyce Emily's company. Joyce Emily brags that her brother, a student at Oxford, has gone off to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and that she, dark and rather mad, wants to go too and march with a gun. Nobody takes this seriously, however, for everybody at the school is anti-Franco if they are anything at all. Francisco Franco was a nationalist general who with others initiated a civil war in Spain, successfully overthrowing the democratic Spanish Republic. After the war, he became the leader of the new fascist Spanish regime. However, Joyce Emily does end up running away to Spain that year. She is swiftly, shockingly killed in an accident when the train she is traveling in is attacked. The school holds a remembrance service for her. By their last year at Blaine, only 4 of the Brodie girls remain. Mary has gone off to be a typist, and Ginny has enrolled at a school of dramatic art. While completing studies at Blaine, Eunice thinks she will go on to study modern languages, but becomes a nurse instead. Monica goes into science, Sandy into psychology. Rose, inheriting her father's instinctive and merry carnality, makes a good marriage soon after she leaves school and shook off Miss Brodie's influence as a dog shakes pond water from its coat. Miss Brodie will never know how easily Rose shook off her influence. She still confides in Sandy that she thinks Rose and Mr. Lloyd will become lovers, which is not so much a theory as part of Miss Brodie's game in bringing the two together. Sandy perceives that Miss Brodie was obsessed by the need for Rose to sleep with the man she herself was in love with. Sandy still visits the Lloyds during this period, and indeed has gotten herself a folk-weave shirt, like those that Mrs. Deirdre Lloyd wears. She psychologizes the Lloyds while with them, and when she looks on as Mr. Lloyd paints a portrait of Rose nude, Sandy notices that the image emerging resembles Rose, but even more than that it resembles Miss Brodie. Sandy has become very interested in Mr. Lloyd's mind, so involved with Miss Brodie as it was, and not accounting her ridiculous. Sandy has told Miss Brodie, and Miss Brodie loves to hear it, that all of Mr. Lloyd's portraits reflect her. Miss Brodie calls herself Mr. Lloyd's muse and predicts that Rose will take her place. Sandy, on the other hand, thinks she is Providence. She thinks she is the god of Calvin. She sees the beginning and the end. Sandy also thinks, perhaps based on her readings in psychology, Miss Brodie is an unconscious lesbian. Much later, after Sandy has become a nun, Rose comes to visit her. Rose has been married for a long time at that point to a successful businessman. The two women agree that Miss Brodie was dedicated to her girls, and Sandy explains that Miss Brodie was forced to retire because of her politics. Monica also comes to visit Sandy when both are adult women, ostensibly seeking marital advice, for she had thrown a piece of burning coal at her sister-in-law, which caused her husband to demand a separation. The two instead talk of Miss Brodie. Sandy explains that Rose never did sleep with Teddy Lloyd, that Miss Brodie did indeed love the artist, and so her renunciation of him was in fact real, not a mere joke as both Sandy and Monica had thought at the time. The narrative shifts back to the summer of 1938, after the last of the Brodie girls have left Blaine. Miss Brodie has gone to Germany and Austria for the summer, while Sandy reads psychology and goes often to the Lloyds to sit for her own portrait, sometimes accompanied by Rose. Once, when Sandy and Mr. Lloyd are all alone because his wife and family are away, Sandy tells him that all his portraits, even that of the littlest Lloyd baby, are turning out to resemble Miss Brodie, and she gives him an insolent stare. As he had 3 years before, Mr. Lloyd kisses Sandy, and the two begin a love affair that lasts for 5 weeks. During the time of their affair, Mr. Lloyd paints Sandy a little. She tells him that he is making her look like Miss Jean Brodie in the portrait, and he begins a new canvas, but it was the same again. Sandy asks Mr. Lloyd why he is obsessed with Miss Brodie, pointing out her ridiculousness. Mr. Lloyd concedes that she is ridiculous, but tells Sandy to stoop analyzing his mind, an unnatural habit in a girl of 18. In September, Miss Brodie and Sandy meet at the Braid Hills Hotel, where Miss Brodie discusses Hitler, quite sure that fascism, either Hitlerian or general, will save the world. Sandy is bored. At last Miss Brodie comes to the point. Rose tells me you have become his Mr. Lloyd's lover, she says. Sandy says she has, because Mr. Lloyd interests her. Miss Brodie responds that, as a Roman Catholic, Mr. Lloyd can't think for himself, is all instinct, and therefore not suitable for an insightful person like Sandy. Mr. Lloyd continues painting accidental portraits of Jean Brodie, even though he recognizes as Sandy does that she is not to be taken seriously. Their affair continues even once Mrs. Lloyd returns with the family, all the more dangerously and excitingly. By the end of the year, however, Sandy has lost interest in Mr. Lloyd the man, but is nonetheless deeply absorbed in his mind. She is especially interested in his Roman Catholic religion, an interest she takes with her even after leaving Mr. Lloyd. Eventually, of course, Sandy becomes a Roman Catholic nun. The following autumn, Sandy meets Miss Brodie several times, discussing Mr. Lloyd as usual, how his portraits all reflect the lover who renounced him. Miss Brodie tells Sandy that, however strange, it is she, Sandy herself, and not Rose who was destined to be the great lover. Miss Brodie also confides in Sandy that she regrets urging the young Joyce Emily to go to Spain to fight for Franco. Sandy had not been aware of Miss Brodie's influence to this effect till that moment. That autumn, Sandy returns to Blaine to see Miss McKay, and tells her that Miss Brodie is still cultivating sets of girls at once precocious and out of key with their classmates. Sandy advises Miss McKay to attempt to unseat Miss Brodie on the grounds of her fascist political interests. Sandy then explains that she is telling all this to Miss McKay because she wants to put a stop to Miss Brodie. When the time comes to force Miss Brodie to retire because of her politics, Miss McKay does not fail to say to her that it had been a Brodie girl who had betrayed her. Sandy is to leave Edinburgh at the end of the year. When she goes to the Lloyds to say goodbye, she looks around Mr. Lloyd's studio and sees the portraits on which she had failed to put a stop to Miss Brodie. Sandy is fuming with Christian morals at this point. It is in the end of the summer term of 1939 that Miss Brodie is forced to retire, on the grounds that she had been teaching fascism. Sandy has entered the Catholic Church by then, where she meets a number of fascists, much less agreeable than Miss Brodie. Miss Brodie writes to Sandy to tell her of her retirement, theorizing that the political question was only an excuse, and that what Miss McKay really disapproved of was her educational policy. Miss Brodie is most hurt and amazed to believe that one of her own special girls has betrayed her. She tells Sandy that she could suspect any of her girls of the betrayal save Sandy herself. Sandy replies, "If you did not betray us, it is impossible that you could have been betrayed by us." Over the years, many Brodie girls contact Sandy after she has become Sister Helena of the Transfiguration and published The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. Jenny writes that Miss Brodie is past her prime and obsessed with the question of who betrayed her. Jenny also visits Sandy, and Sandy tells her, clutching the grill which separates the two women, that Miss Brodie was quite an innocent in her way. Monica visits Sandy as well, and reports to her that Miss Brodie at last suspects her, Sandy, of the betrayal. "It's only possible to betray where loyalty is due," Sandy says. And then there is the day that the inquiring young man visits Sandy, an incident first described in Chapter 2, speaking with her through the grill which Sandy clutched more desperately than ever. He asks her about her formative influences from her school days: literary, political, personal, Calvinism. Sister Helena responds, "There was a Miss Jean Brodie in her prime." The moral of the prime of Miss Jean Brodie is a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation, unchecked authority, and the misuse of influence over impressionable minds. Thanks for staying with us. Your support truly means everything.